Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, this is a place for stories that stay with you. The quiet ones, the kind that sneak up on you. If that sounds like your thing, consider following along so you don't miss what's coming. Now, let's get into today's story. Mara Voss had never seen the cabin in person before she bought it. She'd found the listing at 2 in the morning, scrolling through property auctions the way some people scroll through old photographs. Not really looking for anything, just needing her hands busy while her mind sat still. The photos were bad, grainy, yellow-tinted, taken with someone's flip phone a decade earlier. A slanted porch, a stone chimney with ivy crawling up one side like it was trying to swallow the house whole. The listing had been up for 412 days. Nobody wanted a two-room cabin an hour past cell service, accessible only by a gravel road that flooded every spring. Mara wanted exactly that. She was 46 years old, 6 months divorced, and 3 weeks removed from the architecture firm she'd spent 19 years building into something with her name on the door. She hadn't quit, she'd just stopped showing up in any way that mattered, until her partners suggested, gently, that she take some time. Everyone was very gentle with her lately. It was starting to feel like being handled. The cabin sat at the end of a switchback road in the Bitterroot foothills, half a mile above a town called Selkirk Hollow that had one gas station and a church with a bell nobody rang anymore. When Mara's car finally crested the last rise, the porch was worse than the photos. One step had rotted clean through, but the light coming down through the pines onto the roof did something to her chest she hadn't felt in longer than she could name. She stood in the yard for a long time before she went inside. The cabin itself gave up its secrets easily. A wood stove, a bed frame with no mattress, shelves someone had built by hand, slightly uneven, the kind of imperfection that comes from care rather than carelessness. Mara moved through the rooms touching things, the cool of the stove, the grain of the shelving, cataloging the place the way she used to catalog buildings before she stopped trusting her own judgment about what deserved saving. It was the third room she almost missed. A narrow door off the kitchen, painted the same faded green as the walls so it nearly disappeared. She tried the handle out of habit, more than curiosity, and it didn't move at all. Locked, not stuck, locked. A deadbolt, newer than everything else in the house, bolted into wood that had to be 70 years old. She crouched and looked at the gap beneath the door. Cold air moved against her fingers, the kind of cold that only comes from being underground. A cellar. Someone had put a modern lock on an old cellar door, and then, as far as Mara could tell from the layer of dust and the spider web sealing the frame, never opened it again. She sat back on her heels in the dim kitchen light and felt something she hadn't felt in the 19 years of the firm, in the 11 years of her marriage, in any of the rooms she'd designed for other people to live their lives in. She felt curious, genuinely, quietly curious about something that had nothing to do with her at all. She'd ask around town tomorrow. Surely someone remembered who'd lived here last and why they'd wanted whatever was down there kept so carefully out of reach. Selkirk Hollow woke up slowly, the way small towns do when they've stopped expecting anything new to happen to them. Mara drove down at 9 the next morning and found exactly one place open, a combination gas station and general store with a hand-painted sign that read Purdy's, though the woman behind the counter introduced herself as Nell. She was somewhere in her 70s, sharp-eyed, with the kind of face that had spent a lifetime deciding things about people at first glance and rarely being wrong. When Mara mentioned which cabin she'd bought, Nell's hands went still on the counter. Just for a second, then she kept stacking cans like nothing had happened at all. "You're the one who bought the Whitfield place," Nell said. "It wasn't a question." "I didn't know it had a name," Mara said. "Everything up here has a name. Doesn't mean people use it," Mara asked, carefully. If Nell had known the family. Nell's answer came slower than it should have for such a simple question. "Knew of them, different thing than knowing them. She said it the way you close a door you don't want opened again, And Mara, who had spent 19 years learning to read rooms full of investors who didn't want to say no directly, understood she wasn't getting anything more standing at that counter. She bought coffee, a bag of nails, and a padlock key set on the off chance it would help, and drove back up the mountain no wiser than when she'd left. The cellar door hadn't moved, of course. Doors don't move on their own. But something about walking past it all afternoon while she cleared brush and patched the porch step made the silence behind it feel less like emptiness and more like waiting. Around 4, a truck came grinding up the gravel road, and a man climbed out who introduced himself as Cole, said he did odd jobs for half the mountain, and had heard a stranger bought the Whitfield place, figured she might need firewood before the nights turned. He was maybe 50, weathered in the unhurried way of men who worked outside, and he looked at the cabin the way you look at someone you used to know who's changed more than you expected. "You been in the cellar yet?" he asked, too casually for the question to actually be casual. "It's locked. New bolt on an old door." Cole nodded slowly, like this confirmed something he'd already half believed. "Leave it," he said. "Nothing good ever come from opening what the Whitfields shut." Mara laughed a little, thinking he was teasing her. He didn't laugh back. "I mean it," he said, and there was no humor left in his voice at all. "Some things get locked away because somebody decided they should stay locked away. Best to let dead men keep their own secrets." He left the firewood stacked by the porch and didn't stay for coffee, and Mara stood in the yard and watched his taillights disappear down the switchbacks, feeling the particular chill of having asked an innocent question and gotten a warning in return. That night she sat at the kitchen table with a lantern, 3 feet from the green door, and thought about her marriage, how she and Daniel had gotten so good at not asking each other real questions that by the end they'd run out of anything else to say. She thought about the firm, and the version of herself who used to believe that every building told the truth about the people who built it, if you were patient enough to listen. She looked at the deadbolt gleaming faintly in the lamplight. Whatever Cole believed was down there, whatever had made an entire town go quiet at the mention of the Whitfield name, she was done living in a house where she was too polite, or too tired, or too afraid to open a door. In the morning she drove 40 minutes to the hardware store in the next town over, bought a bolt cutter, and came home to finish what curiosity had started. The bolt cutter was heavier than Mara expected, and her hands weren't as steady as she wanted them to be when she finally knelt in front of the green door. She told herself it was just old hardware, just rust and time, nothing that deserved the way her heart had picked up its pace. The deadbolt gave with a sharp metallic crack that seemed too loud for the quiet cabin, and the door swung inward on hinges that hadn't been oiled in decades, releasing a breath of air that smelled like earth and cedar and something else underneath. Old paper, maybe, or dried flowers, gone soft with age. Mara stood at the top of a narrow wooden staircase and clicked on her flashlight. The beam found stone walls, a dirt floor, and rows of shelving built into the far wall with the same careful, uneven hand as the shelves upstairs. Whoever built this cabin had built this cellar too, and had done it with love rather than obligation. She went down slowly, testing each step. The cold wrapped around her ankles first, then her arms, the particular cold of a space that had been sealed away from sunlight for a very long time. At the bottom, she swept the flashlight across the room and felt her breath catch, not from fear, but from something closer to wonder. There was no treasure, no skeleton, no crime scene, none of the things Cole's warning had planted in the back of her mind. Instead, the shelves were lined with mason jars, dozens of them, their contents long since gone to dust and shadow, but each one labeled in careful, faded handwriting. Peaches, 1961. Blackberry preserves, 1964. Beans, 1958. And beneath the shelves, stacked in wooden crates, were books, journals, by the look of their cracked leather covers, at least 15 of them, arranged by year in a system someone had clearly cared about maintaining. On the small table in the corner sat a single framed photograph, face down, and beside it a child's toy horse carved from pine, one ear chipped away. Mara picked up the photograph first, A young couple stood in front of the cabin, the man's arm around the woman's shoulders, both of them squinting into sunlight that had long since faded from the print. Between them stood a girl, maybe 7 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, holding the very same pine horse now sitting on the table. Mara turned it over. Written on the back in the same hand as the jar labels, Thomas, Ruth, and Ellie, the last good summer. She sat down on the bottom step, the photograph in her lap, and understood without yet knowing any of the details that she had not stumbled onto a mystery meant to frighten her. She had stumbled onto a grief someone had spent decades trying to keep sealed away from the light, the way you seal away anything you cannot bear to look at, but cannot bring yourself to destroy. She reached for the nearest journal, its spine soft with age, and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was small, careful, a woman's hand. It began simply, "If anyone ever reads this, I hope it means Thomas finally let this place go." Mara glanced up the stairs toward the fading afternoon light, then back down at the words in her lap, and understood she wasn't going to make it back upstairs before dark. Whatever had happened to this family, whatever had made Thomas Whitfield seal a cellar full of preserves and journals and a dead girl's toy horse behind a modern deadbolt, was about to become the only thing Mara Voss wanted to think about for a long, long time. If you've ever found something in an old house that made you feel like you were trespassing on someone else's grief, drop the word Ellie in the comments. I'd love to know I'm not the only one who's felt that. Mara read until the lantern burned low, and her eyes ached, and by the time she finally climbed the stairs back into the kitchen, she understood most of what had happened to the Whitfield family, though not yet why it mattered so much that a whole mountain still went quiet at the name. Ruth Whitfield's journals spanned 11 years. Beginning the spring, she and Thomas built the cabin with borrowed lumber and $140, and ending abruptly in the autumn of 1967. The early entries were ordinary in the way that made them precious. Canning schedules, a fight with Thomas over whether to get electricity run up the mountain, the particular joy of Ellie learning to whistle. Then, 3/4 of the way through the final journal, the entries changed. Ellie got sick that September, Ruth wrote, in handwriting that had lost its careful evenness. Fever wouldn't break. Dr. Anselm from the Hollow came twice, said it was her lungs, said we should have brought her down the mountain sooner, before the rain started and the road went under. Thomas won't forgive himself. I don't know how to tell him I can't forgive him either. Not yet, maybe not ever, though I know that isn't fair. The girl had died in the cabin, 8 years old, because the gravel road that Mara herself had driven up in a rented SUV had been impassable during the 1 week it mattered most. The journal ended 2 weeks after the funeral, mid-sentence, as though Ruth simply hadn't been able to hold the pen any longer. Mara sat with that for a long while before she understood the second half of the story, which came from Nell, 2 days later, after Mara drove back down to Purdy's and told her, carefully, respectfully, what she'd found. Nell's composure finally cracked, just slightly, at the edges. Thomas never forgave the county for that road, she said. Petitioned for years to get it paved, and they kept saying no, kept saying it wasn't worth it for 2 families and a handful of hunters. He blamed the road. Ruth blamed him for not carrying her down the mountain on his own back if he had to. They stayed together, but something in that house died with Ellie, and neither of them ever really came back from it. Ruth had passed first, in 1989, quietly, of nothing dramatic at all. Thomas lived another 6 years alone in the cabin, refusing every offer to sell, until Cole's own father, his closest neighbor and one of the only people Thomas still spoke to, found him one morning in his chair by the cold wood stove. Cole was there when they cleared the place out, Nell said. Said Thomas made him swear, near the end, that the cellar stayed shut, said there were things in there he couldn't stand the thought of strangers pawing through. Cole put that lock on himself, out of respect, and I suppose over the years it just turned into one of those things nobody questions anymore. A mountain superstition with a real grief underneath it. Mara thought about that the whole drive back up, how a warning that had sounded almost supernatural on Cole's porch was, underneath, just one man trying to protect his dead friend's heartbreak from indifferent hands. She thought about her own house, sold in the divorce, and the boxes of Daniel's things she'd been too proud to ask him to come collect, and the difference between protecting a memory and being buried by one. That evening she went back down into the cellar, not with fear this time, but with something closer to tenderness, and gathered the journals, the photograph, and the small chipped pine horse, carrying them upstairs into the light where they belonged. Word travels strangely on a mountain, slower than in a city, but somehow further. Within a week, half of Selkirk Hollow seemed to know that the new owner of the Whitfield place had found Ruth's journals and Ellie's horse, and instead of the wariness Mara had braced for, what came up the gravel road instead was something closer to relief. An older woman named Doreen, who turned out to have gone to school with Ellie for the 2 brief years the girl had attended before she got sick, drove up one Sunday with a jar of her own blackberry preserves and asked, almost shyly, if she could see the cellar. Mara said yes. Over the following month, that became something of a pattern. Not a parade, nothing that would have felt like a violation, but a slow trickle of people who had known the Whitfields, or known someone who had, coming to sit at Mara's kitchen table and read a page or two of Ruth's handwriting, and leave a little lighter than they'd arrived. Cole came too, eventually, apology sitting plainly on his face before he said a word of it out loud. "I should have just told you," he said, turning his hat in his hands, the way men do when they're uncomfortable with their own softness. "Wasn't my secret to keep quiet about anymore. Not after Thomas passed. I just didn't know how to talk about it without talking about all of it." Mara told him there was nothing to forgive, and meant it, and asked if he'd help her fix the road. Not pave it, that fight had died with Thomas, but grade it properly, shore up the worst of the low spots, so that no family living up there again would ever be one bad storm away from the thing that had happened to the Whitfields. Cole looked at her for a long moment, then nodded, once, like a decision settling into place. They spent that fall working on it together, along with 2 of Cole's cousins and, on weekends, Doreen's grown son with his own pickup truck. Mara found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, doing something with her hands and her hours that had nothing to do with proving anything to anyone. She kept the journals in a cedar box she built herself, badly, with her own uneven joints that reminded her pleasantly of Thomas's old shelving. She kept the pine horse on the kitchen windowsill, where the morning light found it first. She did not fill the cellar with anything of her own. Some rooms, she'd decided, deserved to stay open rather than full. In November, on the anniversary of Ellie's death, half the mountain gathered in Mara's yard, and Doreen read a page from Ruth's journal aloud, the one about Ellie learning to whistle, chosen deliberately for how much joy sat inside it. And afterward nobody cried in the sad way, only in the way people cry when a hurt that's gone unspoken for decades is finally allowed to be spoken instead. Mara stood at the edge of the gathering, mug of coffee warming her hands, and thought about the version of herself who'd found that green door, and felt, for one strange instant, more curious than she had in years, about something that had nothing to do with her. She understood now that it had everything to do with her. She'd come up this mountain running from a life that had gone quiet in all the wrong ways, and she'd found, instead, a family who'd let their grief seal them off from the world entirely, and a whole town that had been waiting, without quite knowing it, for someone to open that door and let them grieve out loud together. She wasn't finished with her own grief. She suspected she never entirely would be, but she'd stopped locking the doors on it, and some evenings, when the light came down gold through the pines the way it had that very first afternoon, that felt like enough. If this story stayed with you, we'd love to have you back for the next one. Hit subscribe, and we'll see you in the next story.